Következzen első plenáris előadónk, professzor Erin Gerlach a Potsdami Egyetemről, akinek előadás címe a testnevelés oktatásának aktuális trendjei. Professzor úr, át is adom a szót.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being invited here. I hope you can hear me and everything's all right. And you can see me also. So thank you for the honor of being invited here and being allowed to hold this presentation today. Especially thank you to Tamás, Claude Scheuer and Roland Nauel. This presentation was developed in close collaboration with Professor Dr. Christian Hermann, who is also one of the persons who will talk this afternoon. I'm talking about current trends in didactics of physical education regarding the quality of physical education. Because Christian Hermann and me, we are empirical researchers. This will happen with a focus on employment and empirical studies. The reason behind is that we will only be successful, in our opinion, if we have an empirical basis for our action measures initiatives. So this is a theoretical presentation which aims at realization of empirical research with some consequences for the practice in physical education. The starting point is not a vacation of mine with my two little daughters a couple of years ago when they're holding the Pisa Tower, but the so-called Pisa studies. The Pisa studies is, they were called in Germany as a Pisa shock. And there was a German arrogant perspective in the land of thinkers, writers, and poets. Students did not perform very good in comparison to other countries. So that was the reason why there was a big revolution almost in the educational system with different aspects like in increasing evidence-based evaluation in the educational sector, a lack of empirical evidence, especially in all subjects, but moreover in PE, and a shift to school effectivity research. That means that we should know what the effects of physical education in schools are. There was at first a shift from an input to an output orientation. So what put we into the process and what take we out? And the next step was a shift to a process orientation, that we look what kind of process it takes place in physical education. And that is a question that we will ask: what are output aspects and what are process aspects? And now I'm telling you a story about a chicken, a worm, and an egg. How substantial might be the sunny side up egg be? How good would it taste? It depends on how healthy the chicken is. It depends on if they are living in cages. It depends if they are freeland chicken, or even if they are living on organic farms, and what they eat. So that means if the worm is healthy, the chicken might be healthy, and the egg is a wonderful sunny side egg, which is tasting good. Nothing is so practical like a good theory. And a theory is only a net to catch fishes, where you depends how rough or fine a net is and where you can focus on. So the theory is more a map where you can focus on and can guide you to the research process. And this chicken worm theory is something like a map where we can look at. This theoretical approach is also compatible to other models we know from health sciences or from socio-ecological sciences. If we take a look on the inputs, then we can see different things like the mission of PE in a country, the curriculum, the number of lessons. All these are aspects which are aspects of quality PE, which are already named in different presentations. Teacher-student ratio and resources in terms of financial resources, personal resources, for example, well-educated physical education teachers, and facilities and equipment. The put in the middle is the context and the process. And what we can see there are school management processes, the school climate within the teachers and principals, organization of PE in the school, and moreover, meaningful contents which will be presented in physical education in school, and the instructional quality. If we take a look into the effects or outputs in this context, then we usually find formulations from different perspectives, like from the ISO position statement. They say it's a knowledge, skill, and disposition that allow students to be informed and responsible decision makers related to engagement in physical activity and sport in their life. And the guidelines for policymakers and for the quality PE said it is a lifelong engagement in physical activity and sport to acquire psychomotor skills, cognitive understanding, social and emotional skills. They need to lead you to a physically active life. And some people from the area of physical literacy also find things that it's a competence, confidence, motivation, and knowledge and understanding to value and take responsibility for an engagement in physical activities in life. So a lifestyle physical activity is a long-term output, perhaps, or a middle-term output. We don't really know it. And the differentiation between the different effects and products, you can see in different terminology here in my model. It's the short-term output. We are talking about motor competence, about confidence, motivation, interest, knowledge, and perhaps executive functioning. Moreover, we are talking about intention in and about physical activity, exercise, and sport involvement. And it might be result in a behavioral dimension, participation, and physical activity, and finally in active lifestyles. A long-term effect is the transmission of cultural traditions, specific sport culture in a different country, for example, and health and healthy people in our population in terms of physical health, social health, and psychological health. And at this point, I would like to criticize some of the work which was done in the past in terms of fitness assessment, right? We, and perhaps Christian Hermann, will mention him, developed some instruments as short-term outputs, which belong to motor competence, and that will be presented in the corner 8 today in a video. And the critics to fitness assessment have 2 reasons. The one reason is that those effects are not sustainable. If we do train something to have, for example, a better endurance, then it's fine. But if we do not train anymore and we are not active enough, then endurance will decline. But what we do in schools should have sustainable effects, sustainable learning effects. So the mechanisms behind the development of something what students do in school is learning and not adaptation. The second reason will be explained later on when I focus on context and process, especially on the area of instructional quality. So the outline of my presentation is what is instructional quality in other subjects? What is instructional quality in PE? What are similarities and differences, and what does it mean for PE? The aim is to bring you some innovations from a general educational perspective to PE, and to bring some innovations to PE research and practice. These findings were published in a journal which is called Instructional Science with colleagues from general educational research and the didactics of history and chemistry. The first part is a systematic review on the research state about quality PE in the German-speaking countries. And the second part is a comparison with the general, so-called generic framework from instructional research. The chicken warm egg model has also a serious representation in empirical research, what you can see here. And so the main aspect is that on the left-hand side, we have teachers and their competencies they bring into the physical education. And on the right-hand side, you can see right here, there are aspects in terms of PE, in terms of beyond and educational aspects. And if we focus on quality PE, and I like the differentiation Claude Scheuer made on the first day, that he said, the micro level, the instructional research, the instructional level right here is quality PE, and the whole model is the quality of physical education. So if we focus on this, on the instructional part, then we can see that we see instructional quality, we see the instructional methods, and we see the time we spend in physical education. And from other subjects, we know that the one is called the deep structure of quality, quality of instruction, and the instructional method in the time is a surface structure. And from other subjects, we know that the deep structure has a higher effect for learning outcomes in terms of performances than the surface structure. And this is an avenue we might look at, and perhaps that might be interesting for research in physical education and also for practice in physical education. So what did we find in instructional research and didactical theory? We find the so-called 10 rules of good teaching. And perhaps some of you know some of them. Some of you might find things, what they do already in school. And these 10 rules in the literature were also made from Helmke from an empirical approach, and also made from Magyar from a theoretical approach. I don't want to be too religious, but it's sometimes these rules were sometimes called the 10 Commandments in the Bible, and the teaching Bible for pre-service and in-service teacher. And a lot of generations of pre-service and in-service teachers receive feedbacks in these dimensions when we are calling about quality of instruction. The aspects were quite similar and have a large overlapping, but it is interesting to see that you can reach the same goal from an empirical and from a theoretical perspective. Recent empirical research in the general educational research said one central direction of impact for this research is that we have to identify superordinate factors, especially which are independent from each other, and there are economical core principles for quality of instruction in all subjects. Core principle for research, but core principle also for people in practice. So I talked about recent research in quality, instructional quality and quality of instruction. And that is the approach of the 3 generic basic dimensions of quality. So this new research from the PISA studies tried to concentrate on bundle these dimensions to some superordinate factors. Sometimes they were even called the big 3 of teaching quality. The first one is classroom management, and this describes all strategies which aims at realizing a structured and undisturbed learning environment to maximize learning time, so time and task. So people in PE would say, hey, this is the time we invest in movement and learning in movement. It's the old work of Kuhnen, who is the father of classroom management. There are behind clarity of rules, clarity of objectives, discipline, and prevention strategies of teachers to not to be disturbed. The second reference, the second dimension is social-emotional support or classroom climate sometimes. This comes from the German reform pedagogy and from self-determination theory of Ryan and DC. There are aspects which are made an interaction style which contains instructional support for content learning on the one hand, and on the other hand for a social support on an emotional level for an active participation in PE and beyond. So self-determination theory is the basis, and the idea is that there is a fulfilling of basic psychological needs of the learners. The third part is a potential for cognitive activation in other subjects. So the reference here is the subject meta didactics and the subject pedagogies. And this dimension describes all actions of teachers to stimulate activities of students, activation, conversation, activation, activities, which are focused on a deeper understanding of content and a deeper understanding of the subject-specific learning. So it's something like an intelligent learning. It's not only throwing the ball, it's a question why and how we throw the ball to be able an active decision maker in physical education and beyond. Now we're coming to new development in the area of empirical and theoretical instructional quality. And some colleagues of us, Anna Pretorius and Charalambous, invented or developed a new synthesis of generic and subject-specific frameworks. So again, these three generic dimensions I already mentioned are classroom management and time management, cognitive activation, and social emotional support. And the critics to these three dimensions is that they are can only be seen during a lesson. And the other thing, they are not subject specific, and we can only see what happens in these dimensions if we know what are the objectives a teacher has for the lesson. So these, so careful planning of lessons of the teacher is not represented in these three dimensions. So there were other things which came up, for example, content selection and presenting the content. That means that people, and especially teachers, have to select what kind of content they are selecting, which are important and which are meaningful for the physical education pupils, and to connect them to a real world, to make a real world scenario. And the other thing is presenting then in a structured, accurate, and correct way. Other things are practicing, so practicing, promoting procedural skills and abilities, handling of difficult and errors in practicing, and formative assessment, so permanent checks, whether it works, what they are learning, permanent checks, what people think and what they do in the different subjects, and also in physical education. Moreover, we have cutting across instructional aspects which are more on a superordinate level, but this framework will be used to later to take a closer look on what we know on research in PE. The blue marked aspects can only be rated and can only be seen with if you have an expertise in the field. So the appropriate content selection and presentation, the practicing formative assessment, to rate this, you have to have an expertise in the field, and that it's not possible that somebody who comes from the outside is giving you an accurate assessment of what quality in PE is good. So coming now to the next part, what is instructional quality in PE? Again, we have made a systematic review, Christian Hermann and me, and we found two colleagues of us in the German-speaking countries who found also these 10 rules of good teaching. And again, you find a great overlap in the different aspects. And the black written aspects are almost the same what we had in general educational research. But these colleagues made some amendments. And for example, Gibkin has said it should be not only an instructional climate and a social climate, it should be a movement-friendly instructional climate. And Steinegger made two amendments, the verification of safety to prevent accidents in physical education, and the multi-perspectivity of sport and physical education, and to accentuate the contents in different perspectives to bring them closer to PE pupils. And again, like in general educational research, Christian and his colleagues made also a view on the three basic dimensions of quality of instruction, the big three of instructional quality. And again, in black, you can see different aspects of classroom management, which are important in each subject: discipline, clarity of rules, smooth organization, and so on. And you can see some red marked aspects, which are an accentuation of classroom management and physical education. So consideration of competitive elements of sport in physical education, if we use contents which are close linked to sport, and consideration of room and safety to prevent accidents. The second dimension, social-emotional support, again, we have aspects on the teacher's side and positive motivational feedback and emotional support. And again, we have some problems, which I will go into detail later on, physical exposure and multi-perspectivity in PE. And on the right-hand side, you can see a strong adaptation for the third dimension, cognitive activation, which is at least adapted as a movement-related part of activation. Christian called it cognitive and motor activation. I will go into detail in the next slides. Now we're coming to the first part and go to detailed classroom management. And in this picture, you can see how complicated classroom management in PE is in comparison to other subjects. So movement time is perhaps a specific aspect of PE. But when we look at empirical studies, and you can see here some studies from national and international research, you have perhaps a nominal time of 90 minutes. Well, in Germany, that means 2 lessons of physical education. Pupils have to change the room and have to change the clothes, so we're losing time. The real time is only 80 to 90%. Then we have a usable instruction time in physical education, because we also have the installation of equipment and the materials we have to prepare and so on. And again, we have an instructional time which had only 50 to 55%. And again, we have explanations to make. We have an organization of the exercise, and we have transition between different phases of education. And finally, what is left are only 20 minutes out of 90 minutes of movement time. And this is quite, this is not really encouraging, that you say only 20 minutes of 90 minutes are movement time. And there's a tension on the, so physical adaptation in this context are quite hardly to achieve. And there's even a higher heterogeneity than we say. We have some people which are PE deniers, which are physically less passive, which are less participation, which are less active, less and more passive, excuse me, and which are less participation participating in PE. And that means if we look at only 20% of the whole lesson we can use for movement and exercise, what kind of effects can be expected and which effects are sustainable? And at this point, I want to give my second argument against fitness assessment in physical education. These are not sustainable, and against the backdrop of these results, it is not realistic that we achieve real effects in fitness measures and fitness measures. So we changed in Germany the terminology from movement time to movement learning time, but the cognitive procedures with handling, with action and with performance and with movement are also important. We come to the second part of the big 3 dimensions, social emotional support in classroom climate. Here a picture where you can see perhaps the climate might not be the best in physical education. And even the person in the background who's also has anxiety when he looks what his colleague is doing and how he is blamed in this situation. When we look at theoretical and empirical research, we found different aspects like subdimension of climate, positive student-teacher relationships, positive student-student relationship, and general aspects of instruction, for example, motivational feedback and satisfaction. Empirical research revealed a correlation of this dimension with motivational and personal aspects such as self-concept, motivation, and well-being. And these aspects were also mentioned in the first presentation of Claude Scheuer, that there are important aspects of output aspects of physical education. But there are also some problems. So we have a transparency of motor performance in PE in comparison to other subjects. And this leads to the situation that we always are comparing our performances with others. And this is a sensitive situation. And sometimes it leads to shame situation and a physical exposure, which might be, especially for people with low performances, with low ability, is quite complicated and leads to a lower self-concept, a lower motivation, and that they avoid to be in the sport of physical education. Moreover, there's a dominance perhaps of the sport culture, and specific ideals about body perception norms are quite strong and are a problem if we show our body in physical education in this competitive environment. So physical education is a very sensitive setting where we have to take a look at. We're coming to the third dimension, cognitive and motor, movement-related activation. And what I have already said is that movement and PE can be described as an interplay between action, motor action, and knowledge. And this knowledge can be implicit. That means that somebody knows how he does, but he cannot explain it. For example, when we are driving a bike, please explain it to somebody else. It's quite complicated. And moreover, explicit knowledge, that we know rules, that we know something about movement, that we know something about problems in when we are learning something. And these activities are consequently intertwined with each other. So that means cognitive and movement-related aspects are playing a game. They are throwing the ball to each other all the time when we have action and physical education. And Christian and his colleagues, for example, Benjamin Niederkofler here, they said activation should have influence on 3 activities on the side of the students: planning the action, planning the movement, realization, the movement, and finally interpretation of the results. And so aspects of activation on the side of the PE teachers should be, we should choose challenging tasks. The tasks should be understandable on the side of the students. It should be a structured learning process so that people really have the chance to learn something. They have to focus on relevant aspects in the movement. It should stimulate and process interpretation of the results. That means PE teachers should ask why and how question. Why do you do that? How did you do that? Please explain it to me. Please explain it to your mate, and so on. And feedback and scaffolding are 2 aspects which are very important from the side of teachers. Okay. These were the systematic review on the German-speaking country on quality in PE. So what are the similarities and differences? And now I will take the view on what we have learned from general educational research in other subjects and what we have learned from quality of instruction in physical education. So what are the similarities and differences? At first, we have a perspective from PE onto the new framework I have mentioned today. So if we look at one idea on classroom management, and you remember the picture of the almost chaotic situation, then we have to say that classroom management is at least partly subject specific. When we look at preventing disturbances, this is the same in all subjects, but the safety issue is something we have especially in physical education, and sometimes we have it also in some aspects like chemistry. So time on task and action is an aspect, preventing accidents, and the flow of movement and the chaotic situation in physical education are something really specific things in physical education. The other aspect is that cognitive activation, which might be one of the main things in other subjects to learn, is a conceptualization which might be too narrow for PE. Motor activation and movement-related activation and the action within PE should be added, and this is a really strong and important amendment. And moreover, what we have seen from research in PE, climate aspects are much more detailed in the literature of PE than it is in the literature of other subjects. For example, the colleague from history said, when we are talking about quality of instruction, we have never talked about climate aspects in our subjects. The other perspective is from the new framework onto PE, and there are also some innovations. So if we are talking about meaningful for the subject and the student, meaningful physical education, then the content selection with the real world scenarios and the presentation of these contents can be regarded as an important quality physical education indicator. Moreover, the framework from the other subjects and from educational research says we have to take a look at formative assessments. For example, that we should give the opportunity for practicing and for action. And perhaps this is something we have seen as part of activation. Again, this is part of movement-related activation. And the final thing, cutting across instructional aspects, that were things we might have more seen as a superordinate aspect, as an educational goal in physical education. What does it mean for PE? And I will give you now an example from Christian and his colleagues in empirical research. And Christian has developed measuring tools and instrument to assess quality PE in these three basic dimensions, with each dimension with 3 subdimensions. And these are the 12 subdimensions he assessed during physical education. And these were assessed by students. This is a blue line. They were assessed by the teachers with a self-rating, and they were assessed by an observer. And there are different aspects you can see here. And at first you can see motivating feedback. So an aspect of social climate is very high, has an effect, or is very high, even in all perspectives. So if we give a feedback to the PE student in service or pre-service, then we would say, this is great what you do in motivating students. We all see it, it's the same. But there are also other things, like here. This is the dimension information processing. So the student said, yeah, there's a lot of things that happened, why and how question, and we have to think about. The PE student said, well, yeah, I did it. It was an average rating of my side. And the observer said, well, you did not do a lot on this. And this is a starting point for reflection and professionalization for teachers in service and in pre-service settings. What does it mean for PE? So we have now research in instructional quality in PE on the micro level of physical education and other subjects, and these matches and have a big overlap. Some subject-specific amendments are necessary. I mentioned already the dimension of classroom management. So more theoretical foundation and empirical research is on activation necessary, especially on movement-related activation, which is linked to cognitive activation. And quality PE should be regarded together with the subject-specific ideas. What are physical education teacher planning? So a configuration of the objective with the content and with the method. And some aspects of the new developed framework from educational research are still blind spots in quality PE research. For example, the selection of contents and the real world scenario, what they do, for example, in selecting transport as a content in physical education. The final question, but is an empirical question. Can these quality PE aspects we measure, can they explain the variety of output and outcome aspects in empirical studies? And we have at least some links that some motivational aspects and some personal aspects, such as self-concept, can be influenced or have at least an association with some of these aspects. So an outlook, interdisciplinary research across subjects and comparison between subjects might be possible. And in schools, we are talking about the same thing when we are talking to another teacher in schools. And these instruments can also use a feedback instrument for pre-service teacher, but also for in-service PE teachers in practice. Moreover, we can use these subject-specific instruments in aspects which are absolutely, at the current situation, absolutely not subject-specific, in ideas, in processes of school visitation, school inspection, and perhaps in demonstration lessons which we use for test somebody in settings like in physical education, teacher education, they can use for formative and summative evaluation. So I hope I have given you some insights into quality of PE research in PE and in the educational research. And I will stop and end my presentation again with a metaphor of the chicken, the egg, and the worm. And I hope you keep it in mind what the worm has an influence on the chicken and on the egg, and we will have in the lunch break a wonderful sunny side egg to eat. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Gerlach, for this really interactive and very informative presentation. And now I would like to pass the word on to Tamás Csányi, and I would like to ask him to moderate the Q&A session with you.
So my first question to you, Erin, would be that we know that the movement time, not movement learning time, the movement time in MVPA, moderate to vigorous physical activity, can be increased through in-service trainings. And what would be your suggestions for the physical education teachers and also for the generalist teachers to increase this movement time from this very low percentage to 15 to 25, what we could see from the researches, but there is some recommendations to increase to 50% of the physical education time.
Thank you so much for this question. So at first I would mention that there are some restrictions to the situation of PE in school. We have to accept not that we are losing time sometimes, and there's nothing, really nothing we can do about it, that we are losing sometimes. On the other hand, it is very important to give students time to be on task, time on task. And this time on task might have a link to your argumentation. And I would interpret this in a good classroom management. But a classroom management not only involves the time we are in action that means in movement time, and it involves also the time we are thinking about some movements. So, for example, if we are training something like speed, we need to have breaks in between. And the breaks can be used for other things. And we also have good movement time, and that is an excellent classroom management. And so physical education and the situation of physical education is restricted to some aspects that we cannot maximize the movement time. And another thing is what I would focus on is if we cannot do that in physical education, then do it in the whole school day, activity breaks. Movement time in the school breaks, out of school sport, out of school activities, and so on. But we have to prepare these activities and this motivation to be active in physical education. And then we have to broaden our perspective on the whole school perspective if we are talking about MVPA. And nobody is there who says MVPA is not important because it has important health effect. But PE is a wrong setting to produce health fitness aspects. It's a setting to motivate people. It's a setting to give them competences to be active. And in the long run, they will be fit and they will have a healthy lifestyle.
Thank you, Erin. Köszönjük szépen Erinnek, és akkor most váltok magyarra, hogy lehessen magyarul is érteni. Illetve azt hiszem, hogy fordítanak közvetlenül, tehát nem is feltétlenül kell váltanom, viszont Erin csak angolul ért engem. So Erin, I will ask the questions in English, so that's the better way. And the Hungarian partners can have the translation. So the first question to you is from Margorzata Bronikovska, that could you please define what do you mean by multi-perspectivity concerning PE?
Okay. I was thinking about when I prepared the presentation that I'm bringing in something that is very popular in the German-speaking countries. And I will give you an example for this. If we have different perspectives to be active in specific sports, then we can make an example in snow sports. If we have a slope run and we are counting the time, then this is a performance perspective. If we have a very soft cross-country skiing, then it's more a health perspective. If we have a formation which we are collaborating on a slope with each other, then this is a social perspective in physical education. And if I jump from a kicker in a freestyle skiing, then it's a perspective of adventure. And in the German didactical context, we have 6 pedagogical perspectives. The multi-perspectivity is to teach physical education in different of these perspectives, to bring them close to students which are perhaps not very familiar with performance and competitive sport.
Thank you, Erin. The next question is coming from Dr. Claude Schreier. Erin mentioned the investigation of the potential impact of differences in instructional quality to the product of the physical education. How about the impact of structural quality on instructional quality?
Yeah, if you take a look at least at the 3 basic dimensions, then you would say, okay, social climate and classroom climate should have an effect on well-being, should have an effect on motivation. If we have a motivating feedback, for example, and the to promote motivation is an important aspect in physical education and much more important than in other subjects. If we look at activation, then cognitive activation should lead to a deeper understanding of what we do in physical education, and movement-related motor activation should lead to the aspect that we learn something like throwing, catching, and so on. And finally, classroom management is a thing that it goes beyond us. It's realizing that we can do the social climate and the activation. But we have one really important empirical finding. So we have seen that classroom management in physical education has an important effect on the growth and motivation and volition. That means in physical education, in comparison to other subjects, classroom management is a really very important thing where we have to focus on in-service and pre-service teaching. And perhaps this is linking to your first question, Tamas, to realize that people are active in physical education is a really important thing. But active can be described in terms of movement-related activities and cognitive activities to understand what we do. And I mentioned you, Thomas, and I'm really sad that you missed the part that I mentioned your first question.
There are no clear questions in the chat room, but I have the last one before the short break. So what would your suggestion for the physical education teachers to reduce the stress of physical exposure in physical education? What should they use in terms of methodology or methods to deal with this problem?
So students are always on a stage in physical education, especially there are some deniers who do not want to be on a stage. So if we are doing something like examinations, then we should do it in a safe way. Please do it in another way and avoid situations that other can watch the, well, let me say, a little bit big guy who's not able to run. Others should not watch him doing that. That's one thing. And the other thing is that students in PE, so pupils in PE, should be able to select what they do. That should not lead to the situation that they are doing nothing, but they should be able to select something to do. And they should be able to participate and find something that is helping them to find a meaningful and worthwhile activity within physical activity. And perhaps somebody should be asked if she wants to demonstrate something. And if we force somebody to demonstrate something and we shame them, that's a real problem in physical education. But it's the same in other subjects. If we call somebody, hey, come to the board and please count what you have done, and the person is not possible, that is really a shaming. And perhaps we are not really sensitive for this.
Thank you very much.
Készült Magyarország kormánya megbízásából az Európai Unió támogatásával.